So, next person to introduce. I hope she's staying a little bit off the stage here, so we can play the music again. And I know her for quite a while as XML girl. So those people actually being active in standardization know who I'm talking about. She was working with PayPal, with Forrester, with Sun. So really a strong strikeout, and now she's with ForgeRock. Please welcome Eve Mahler. So glad you're here, Eve.
Me too.
Okay, for sake of time, I just leave the floor directly to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be back, actually. It's been quite a few years. During my Forrester tenure, I wasn't able to join EIC. So I wanted to talk about user-managed identity and access for the digitally transformative enterprise. So first things first, I think I need to define for you all what I mean by digital transformation. Even if you are responsible for manufacturing outdoor clothing, it's not all about atoms anymore. It's decidedly about bits. For example, your customers now expect you to help them track their fitness and their location, perhaps. And your supply chain partners probably want to integrate with your systems through APIs. And you probably went paperless in your IT systems a long time ago. So that's digital transformation. Now, user-managed identity and access is a phrase that I only first heard looking at the EIC agenda. And I admit to a little bit of feeling a little bit flattered looking at that phrase. But I want to define for you what I think it means. I think thematically, user-managed identity and access has to do with valuing relationships over barriers when it comes to identity and access. And I found this wonderful picture, which I think values relationships over barriers. Wait a second, that's not right at all. You guys are seeing all my notes. No, you're not. Good. I'm seeing all my notes. So a shallow definition of what user-managed identity and access might mean is that it's about systems that enable discretionary choice in identity and access control when it comes to people, even if they're in business and employment situations. But a deep definition might be that it's about systems that enable individuals acting entirely on their own behalf, exercising true free choice in identity, in access control, and in privacy controls when it comes to user management. So those are my definitions for the terms before we get into this. Now, there's a symbiotic relationship when it comes to user-managed identity and access, and that thing we sometimes know as the extended enterprise. Now, this is my little cube for the 3 dimensions of what started out as an unextended enterprise. When it came to the server side, it used to be data centers, and now sometimes it's in the cloud. When it came to the client side, it used to be managed desktops, and now oftentimes it's a personally purchased smart mobile device. And when it comes to user populations, it used to be just employees, maybe what I used to think of as the greater employee population of contractors, and now it's partners, it's employees, it's communities, it's maybe even prospects who aren't even customers yet. So now we've had a lot of aspirations when it comes to user-managed identity and access. And I actually just made this little Wordle here, thinking up a whole bunch of phrases that a lot of us, I think, are familiar with. This is sort of a modern phrase, but it started out with a lot of things that maybe some of us in this community here have worked on. in the technical community, I think, we started out with things like, OpenID and InfoCard and all the way through the Personal Data Ecosystem Consortium and things all the way up to, things I've worked on like User-Managed Access or UMA. In governmental projects, we had things like the Prime Project through Prime Life, through I think Stork, had elements of this, all the way up through NSTIC and IDAP. We've worked on this for a really long time, haven't we? 10, 15 years plus. I remember actually starting work, this is now 7 years ago, on the predecessor to my UMA work, and looking at the Prime Project white papers going, oh man, they put that stuff so well. I wish I'd read that before. So I think there's been a lot of agreement about the problem spaces. In fact, the problem space, I think we're all sort of agreed on. There's a lot of overlap in the problem space. But in a way, what we've seen happen over the last 10 plus years, it didn't really turn out the way we exactly thought it would as experts in the space. Would you agree with that? Let's take a look at what the reality has been. Here's one aspect of reality. Well, there's SAML. Did you know that you could buy this bear? You can go on Cafe Press and buy the SAML teddy bear. It's true. I don't own one. I just use this all the time on my slides. So we actually have in business SaaS vendors pretty much saturation of SAML federated identity, which is kind of cool. Another thing that we have is we have the social login phenomenon, at least for a lot of marketing sites, for a lot of loyalty sites. And it was popularized by, of all companies, Facebook. Who'd have thunk? Another thing that we have is we have the OAuth consent flow. That's part of that sort of social login story. Sometimes with some user choice given at runtime, as you see here, oftentimes not. Another thing that we have that's built up over the last 10 years is web APIs. This is a developer portal picture of Nike. And that's been popularized by mobile and Profit. Here's another thing that happened, the EU cookie directive, which has God knows what effect on actual privacy. Just saying. I had to get that out there. It's just. Here's another thing that I think is fascinating. It doesn't get enough notice. No pun intended, I suppose, talking about notice and consent. The share paradigm. That share button is a really interesting thing. And it's not just Google Apps for business users. It's actually ordinary people using it. I don't know. I'm in a competitive barbershop chorus, and we use Google Docs for sharing documents about our choreography. And you hit that button, and you share when you feel like it, for reasons known only to you. That's really interesting. Finally, we have actual consumer demand for end-to-end encryption in defiance of government requests to add backdoors. This was in the register, but it was actually, a U.S., I think, senator who said, just follow the damn U.S. Constitution, in response to the feds who wanted to disallow that end-to-end encryption, which foils their aims. So let's assess where we are, given that sort of mixed picture. Well, okay, one way to observe this picture is, well, we haven't achieved the user-managed identity and access equivalent of flying cars yet. Although, isn't that cool? It doesn't have any means of propulsion, I would just note. But another way to observe is that we've got some green shoots, some interesting green shoots. So let's just sort of take a step back and say, okay, well, what are the good signs here? Well, one interesting thing is we've got consent at runtime preserved as something we have to offer online users. So we've got that ensconced as a central part of a ceremony. That's actually a good thing. And by the way, that's not something anybody was sort of required to do, and I don't believe that's really part of any of the privacy requirements as part of the regulatory compliance landscape. An OAuth consent flow, that's kind of drawing outside the lines. So that's kind of an amazing thing. That happened all by itself. Another observation I would make is that we've got individuals choosing what persona to expose for what purpose. That happened all by itself. So that's what I would call a green shoot. And then when you get to that, this is the sort of the experience that you have once you click that share button in Google Docs. You have enterprise users most often, but also other users, creating what I think of as scope-grained policy over sensitive resources that they rightly control in a way and at a point that feels entirely natural. It's the right point to capture their constraints on sharing. And we see that in other places too, like in Dropbox and Box, where you can say, share only for this amount of time. That's actually super powerful, and it's the right way of sharing for those kinds of resources. So I consider those actual positives for user-managed identity and access. Now, on the other hand, with apologies to John Gilmore, who said some things about the net and censorship, if you recall, my colleague, Alan Foster, said this to me recently. The enterprise interprets access control as damage and routes around it. And all those systems of things like Google Apps setting of policy and sharing only make us more efficient at that. If you've noticed, it's not really easy to properly control and have governance and auditing as an enterprise over the way we do share, selectively share sensitive resources in those kinds of circumstances. So that's kind of a downside. So with that, I thought maybe I would share with you my thoughts on where we're headed with user-managed identity and access. I'll take a little bit of a longer time horizon than Kim just did. I'm going to say in the next 10 years, given that I've just looked back on the last 10, maybe a little bit more than 10 years, based on a clear-eyed view of how we know humans and enterprises really are and what we really want and need, not what privacy and identity experts wish would happen. So I'll make three predictions. I'm going to lay a Venn on you. You guys may have heard I'm sometimes known as the Queen of Venn. I like Venn diagrams. So this isn't actually a super new Venn, but I've been perpetrating it on some people lately. So my prediction, businesses will leverage a cornucopia of context to address what I'm calling the Venn of business drivers for identity. So my company likes to say identity is the center of everything. And it's actually true. There's nothing you can't do that's important to business without identity, but people don't think about identity all day long. And actually, companies, given their choices, wouldn't think about identity all day long. They do identity for a reason. They don't do it for their health. In fact, they do it for one or two or three of, I would say, these reasons. Protection, authentication, authorization, fraud protection, and or personalization, user experience, customer engagement, driving more customer engagement, and or payment or larger transaction goals. Identity helps drive some or all of these things. And as I think Kim was pretty eloquent about, we need every scrap of context we can possibly gather. We need every scrap of intelligence threat intelligence, fraud intelligence, and customer intelligence to do a good job of all of those. So I think that in 10 years' time, we can comfortably say, we're not going to leave any of that on the table. That's one prediction. Next prediction, maybe harking back to Patrick's presentation, is I think we're going to be ready to have business SaaS applications no longer just be relying parties on identities coming from their customers, but start to accept that their customers can be authorization providers, and they can now be authorization relying parties. That to a certain extent, maybe not to 100%, but significant portions of application entitlements can come from central repositories and not have to live at the edge. And the reason I feel comfortable in saying this is because the pressure is being put on those applications to get the entitlement semantics into scope form by API pressures and by the pressures of API security and identity simplification. We see it now with OAuth. That's why I talk about scope-grained entitlements. And finally, one more prediction that I want to lay on you. Was anybody here in the demonstration that I did in the Kantara workshop this morning? This is a screenshot from that. So this is showing some of the early open source work for my company on OpenUMA, user-managed access. Final prediction. Individuals who we know in the main don't care about identity, unless it's maybe identity theft, and that's a bad thing, or privacy, because they think about it as an opt-in or opt-out checkbox that they hate, will nonetheless become attracted to a data sharing paradigm that means that they can centrally and conveniently control the sharing of all the stuff in their lives through a central data hub. And what you see in this example is somebody who's able to share their allergy record information from their electronic health record and their heart rate data from their implantable cardiac defibrillator with different people and organizations in their lives to different levels of scope as they wish, and remediate and change that access as they wish from a single place. And why are they going to need to do that? And why are they going to want to do that? Well, in the era of web pages, they wouldn't need that. Maybe even in the era of the API economy, they wouldn't strictly need that. But in the era of files and wearables and identity attributes and connected cars, and I tell everybody this, I counted and I have 31 light bulbs in my house. They're going to need that. I was imagining if I actually rented out my house through Airbnb and I wanted to make sure that it was possible to give out access for just 2 days to all my stuff in a limited fashion, the only way to do that is going to be centrally. That's the only way that it's going to happen. Otherwise, it's a nightmare. So I couldn't resist one more Venn just in conclusion. We're in an era where we're hurtling towards the identity singularity. That's actually a good thing for security and privacy and interoperability and simplicity. We're making progress in all these areas, but I think we need 3 things to make sure we actually do accelerate towards that progress. One is we have to work towards measurable trust. There's a lot of work going on in terms of trust frameworks. There's a lot of different groups, a lot of different conversations. So I urge all of you to get familiar with that work. One of the efforts going on is in the UMA group. There's another group at IETF called Vectors of Trust. A lot of different conversations going on. That needs to be solved. We need to be able to make these agreements faster. Second thing is the notion of dynamic introduction and dynamic discovery. IoT needs that in a big way. And the third thing is technical agility. All the emerging technologies that we are getting more comfortable with in the Venn of access control that Jackson was so kind to show, already do that. We cannot sacrifice. We need to have that agility, the restfulness, the cleanliness, the generativity of all that technology. So with that, I'll thank you for your time and attention. 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . . . . . . 。 . . . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . . . 。 . . 。 . . 。 . 。 . 。 . . 。 . 。 . 。 .
。 . . 。 . 。
Thank you so much, Eve. I think you're absolutely right, and I believe this is the right direction to go. The information ownership concept that we see in sharing platforms is something that people start using.
Yeah.
And the more the devices are close to them, the more they will discover that this is of useful. So I think this is the absolutely right direction.
Oh, cool.
But the question for me is, how would you transport this into the community who develops all these things?
Well, we're finding a lot of interest as we talk to people about this. In fact, just here at this conference already, we've had really interesting conversations. Some of it is regulatorily driven. Some of it seems to be interesting as a differentiator for these companies. So I find that some of it comes from turning the tables on what consent means, but some of it is just product functionality. Do you want to add a share button, and is it too hard for you to develop that functionality on your own?
So just use OAuth sharing underneath, something like that.
Well, for example, the UMA protocol is built on OAuth, but OAuth out of the box is only there for runtime consent, which means two applications decided that they want your stuff and they need to ask you first, whereas UMA, the term we use is actually that it's asynchronous consent. So it's a different value proposition, in fact. So the share button I've found is the easiest way to convey that value proposition. So, and looking at health record portals is an easy way to sort of observe that some folks have already built it into their portals, for one example.
The only remaining question is, what happens if people can copy that information?
I've had that conversation a lot lately. The way it went at lunch today was, yes, information wants to be free. You could layer encryption or DRM techniques on top of such solutions. If you add enough friction to the solution that you're propagating, you're making it more attractive to not use that solution and easier to just make a copy the old-fashioned way and not give somebody access to a feed of the data.
Yep.
So it's a difficult balance.
Yeah, but I understand the approach.
So the trick is to make it attractive to give somebody access at your discretion to the true feed of the data, because they get whatever the fresh value is.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
you again.